Hello, so I'm back making another video about the essay I've got to write, which I've already tried to start writing about 5 different occasions. And yeah, I've just got a lot of drafts with a lot of different introductions and stuff. And yeah, really don't know how to go about it, because I feel like what I'm writing is wrong, but then again, it's probably not. So yeah, I'm just going to try and explore some more ideas here. And yeah, I don't think the last video was very good because I only really focused on Aquinas and I didn't really look into the discussion. I just looked into the explaining parts. So yeah. So the question is: conscience is just a fancy name for old-fashioned feelings. Okay, so some progressions I've managed to get onto is basically the idea. Well, the key word in the title is just. So it's basically saying conscience is equivalent to feelings or emotions, and um, based on some of the credible philosophers and religious scholars' perspectives on emotions, I don't think you can really make the two equal. Conscience seems to be more involved in reason, whereas emotions they're sort of innate and inevitable, which means they're perhaps perceived to be lower down than reason, and maybe reason is what distinguishes us from other animals. For instance, an animal has the ability to feel, but it's not so apparent that that animal also has the same capacity as humans to be able to reason. I mean, I'm not saying they can't reason, because they probably do, but it's not like they sit there contemplating things and going back and forth between decisions, and they don't seem to have like an ethical or a moral compass, I guess. They just act more instinctually. Yeah, so to say that conscience is just a fancy word for old-fashioned feelings is definitely an understatement, because if anything, conscience is more like emotions plus right reason equals conscience. Yeah. Okay, so we can look at some philosophers who actually made the claim that emotions need to be kept in check by reason. And this includes people like Plato with his charioteer analogy, where the charioteer has to keep the horses in check, and the charioteer is basically representative of reason or intellect, and the horses are basically representative of our emotions and desires. And yeah, another example of this is John Stuart Mill, who basically argued that pleasures of the mind are higher than pleasures of the body, which but I'm not necessarily sure that that's completely relevant, because yeah, but I guess it is, because he's saying that intellectual pleasures and practicing things like reason or reading books or things like that are higher up than satisfying our desires, our bodily desires. But then again, do you class feelings as a bodily desire, or do you class it as a mental phenomena? And I think that's quite debatable. Okay, we can look at Kant. Kant basically said we should leave emotions completely out of the picture when making moral decisions, because they just cloud things. He saw moral decision making as like almost like a mathematical equation or formula or something like that, where we basically we go down using right reason, and we basically will always end up at the same answer. And but yeah, Kant was criticised for his views because he doesn't put any emphasis on using emotions at all, which is perhaps denying an inevitable and important part of the human experience. Because maybe when we're in a moral dilemma, we often go with what we feel. There's often a sense of intuition which perhaps guides us one way or the other. Like when we're thinking about should we do a certain thing, we're not just considering what's going on in our head. It's not just a purely rational process, it's also an emotional process. Thinking about certain things may make us feel negative or positive, and this may guide our decision in a certain way. And yeah, so but still it doesn't make conscience necessarily completely equivalent to just feelings, because again we have to apply that reason also, because if we were just acting emotionally or instinctively, then perhaps it's more animal-like, and we're not going to end up getting to the right decision, because maybe our motives could get distorted in a way, and that's also what Kant was talking about. If we're acting purely out of emotion, how do we know whether what we're doing is for the greater good, or if it's for perhaps what we've gained pleasure from in the past? And basically we wouldn't be able to know that without using reason. So yeah. We can look at Aquinas. I know I talked about him in my last video, but yeah, Aquinas also takes the view that we need to use right reason, which is given from God. So it's not necessarily, conscience isn't necessarily the voice of God talking directly to us. It's basically we're using a process or something which God gave us, which is reason, and then we're applying this alongside the virtue of prudence in order to unlock synderesis, which is the knowledge of the good. And the synderesis rule is basically do good and avoid evil. And if we do this, we're basically able to tap into conscienza, which I guess can be translated as conscience. And this is basically the application of moral values into everyday experiences or everyday situations. So again, Aquinas would take the view that conscience is not simply emotions. It's not conscience is not just a fancy word for old-fashioned emotion, for old-fashioned feelings, because the rational process is also needed. And this is also apparent when he's talking about vincible and invincible ignorance, where basically he says that in order to make the right moral decision, we have to go through a process of basically reading books, talking to our priest, gaining opinions about what we're going to do, and then once we've done all that, we've gone through the necessary means in order to be able to make the moral decisions. That's when we're able to do it correctly and arrive at the good. And even if we do get it wrong, we can't be blamed for that. God's not able to punish us about that, because basically we did everything we possibly could, and we couldn't have known any better in that situation. So that's what Aquinas believed. But although that might be a good way to make moral decisions when we're perhaps making big moral decisions when we've got time to think, but it's not so practical in perhaps everyday situations where we just have to make quick thinking, instinctual moral decisions about certain things. For example, if a child steps out onto a busy road, we're not going to have the time to go through this whole process of to ensure that our ignorance isn't vincible. We're going to have to act instinctually and think fast, and perhaps this is a purely emotional reaction, a reaction from our conscience, and it just basically drives us to step out onto the road, even if it involves risking our own life. We don't think about that at the time because we just want to save the child, so we step out and we grab the child. And what if this was the wrong thing to do? Then we can criticise Aquinas by saying, well, God's going to punish us for that, even though that seemed like the right thing to do. What if it wasn't, because we didn't have the time to necessarily go through that whole process of making sure that we weren't making a vincible error. But was it purely an emotional or a feelings reaction? Because we can look at Freud here and say that Freud basically saw conscience, even though he wouldn't call it conscience because it's a little bit of a religious term perhaps. He saw conscience as basically the internalized ideals of our parents and society, So if at one point in our lives we were taught to protect children, or through either the means of an action or the words that you shouldn't hit another child, and that's sort of ingrained into us, and we have that reasoning process already stored in our subconscious mind. So when we see a child step out onto a road, it lights up something in our brain, and we say, okay, well, that child's about to be in danger, so we should probably do something about it. So there is a reasoning process going on, and it's not just feelings. Even though it might seem like just a feeling of get the child off the road, it's actually something way more deep than that. And I know this is really speculative, but I think it's there's probably truth to it. So yeah, so either way, I think conscience is definitely a rational process overall. Okay, thanks for watching.